This is CCTV International.
Chinese President Jiang Zemin speaks to U.S. President George W. Bush, offering condolences and assistance in the wake of Tuesday's terrorist attack. Emergency crews dig through mountains of rubble for survivors, but rescue efforts are threatened by fears of a new collapse.
On September the 12th,
in Brussels, NATO gives its backing to a possible military retaliation. And China's top lawmaker Li Peng meets with international dignitaries to discuss strengthening cooperation worldwide. Hello and welcome to CCTV's International News from Beijing. I'm Dong Wei. Chinese President Jiang Zemin and U.S. President George W. Bush exchanged views over the phone Wednesday night about the terrorist attacks on the United States. President Jiang Zemin had sent a message to Bush immediately after Tuesday's attack, expressing his sincere sympathy to the U.S. president, the U.S. government and people, and offering condolences to the family members of the victims. During Wednesday's phone conversation, President Bush thanked President Jiang for his concern. He said that international terrorism is a shared threat to world peace, and he looked forward to working together with China and other nations to strengthen cooperation in cracking down on international terrorism. President Jiang Zemin said that the Chinese people strongly condemn the shocking terrorist activities. China is deeply concerned about the progress of the rescue work and is ready to offer all necessary assistance. President Jiang also hopes the two countries can strengthen dialogue and cooperation in fighting terrorist violence. One day after the worst terrorist strike in U.S. history, investigators began the hunt for who may have been behind the attacks that destroyed New York's World Trade Center and damaged the Pentagon. Law enforcement authorities say many of the hijackers and their associates have been identified, and agents are following hundreds of leads. Steve Nettleton has more.
In Boston, the starting point for the two planes that crashed into the World Trade Center, a normally quiet square is invaded by heavily armed police. Officers marched into the hotel where one of the suspected hijackers is believed to have stayed and detained 3 people for questioning. At the airport, agents seized a car possibly rented by the hijackers and found Arabic language flight training materials inside. In Florida, FBI agents visited apartments where suspected hijackers may have lived while taking flying lessons. Federal investigators say they are focusing on several terrorist groups, including some linked to Osama bin Laden. They also say that the plane that hit the Pentagon may have originally been heading for the White House.
Our government has credible evidence that the White House and Air Force One were targets. A number of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States. The Department of Justice has undertaken perhaps the most massive and intensive investigation ever conducted in America.
U.S. President George W. Bush vowed those responsible will be brought to justice.
The American people need to know we're facing a different enemy than we have ever faced. This enemy hides in shadows and has no regard for human life. This is an enemy who preys on innocent and unsuspecting people, then runs for cover. But it won't be able to run for cover forever.
As though to underscore Bush's comments, a U.S. aircraft carrier took position in the New York harbor on Wednesday, part of an effort to increase sea and air defenses in the United States. Steve Nettleton, CCTV.
In New York, the remaining 7 floors of what used to be the World Trade Center collapsed on Wednesday, more than 30 hours after 2 hijacked planes struck and toppled the Twin Towers. Rescuers continue to dig for survivors in the debris of the leveled buildings. Wang Xin reports.
Casualties of the World Trade Center attack are believed to be in thousands, but the authorities have yet to release an official death toll. Heavy equipment continued to dig through giant piles of rubble in southern Manhattan as emergency workers took the injured to local hospitals. Speaking on television on Wednesday, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell said Americans have reached a common judgment on the terror attacks.
As a headline, it's war.
This is a war. That's the way they see it. You can't see it any other way, whether legally that is correct or not.
You do too?
And yes, I do. And we've got to respond as if it is a war. And we've got to respond in the sense that it isn't going to be solved with a single counterattack against one individual. It's going to be a long-term conflict, and it's going to be fought on many fronts, the military front, the intelligence front.
In Washington, people lined up at the Red Cross to donate their blood to the victims of the jetliner attack against the Pentagon.
We are a wounded America today. We were a wounded America yesterday, and we have seen nothing but a pour out of people to the Red Cross to give blood, to give a piece of themselves, to help people who are in need wherever they are.
Sections of the Pentagon have been reopened to workers, but nearly half the structure had no power, and some employees were asked not to show up. Pentagon officials say some estimates that as many as 800 people died may be far too high. They now say that the death toll is probably between 100 and 200 killed. Wang Xin, CCTV.
In the aftermath of the devastation in the United States, the State Department announced the closure of around 50 diplomatic missions around the world. Elsewhere, the border between Canada and the U.S. remains open, but under tight security. Meanwhile, former U.S. President Bill Clinton left Australia on a U.S. Air Force jet for Hawaii, where he will continue home on a commercial airliner. And the Empire State Building was evacuated after a suspicious package was discovered on the 44th floor. After being put off for a day by the terrorist attacks, the 56th session of the General Assembly of the United Nations opened at the UN headquarters in New York on Wednesday. It passed a resolution condemning the terrorist attacks in the U.S. Han Sung-soo, South Korean Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, was elected as the new president of the Assembly. He lashed out at the attacks, saying they ran counter to every principle of the UN. Zhu Yan has the details.
The resolution passed unanimously strongly condemns the heinous acts of terrorism, which caused enormous loss of human life in the host city of the United Nations. It expressed member states' condolences and solidarity with the people and the government of the United States and urged international cooperation to bring the perpetrators, organizers, sponsors of the attacks to justice. UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan addressed the opening session of the Assembly. He reiterated his appeal for action against terrorism. He called on member states to go further under the UN Charter and relevant resolutions to take action both against terrorists themselves and against all those who give them any kind of shelter, assistance or encouragement. Annan also noted that the Special General Assembly session on children was delayed rather than cancelled. Meanwhile, the UN has begun withdrawing 80 expatriate staff from Afghanistan because of security fears after Tuesday's terror attacks on the U.S., but it says the pullout is temporary. Zhu Yan, CCTV.
In Europe, NATO has invoked a mutual defense clause for the first time in its history, opening the way for a possible collective military response to Tuesday's attacks on the United States. NATO Secretary-General George Robertson read a statement at a news conference in Brussels, saying that
the Council agreed that if it is determined that this attack was directed from abroad against the United States, it shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which states that an armed attack against one or more of the Allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all.
this principle dates back to NATO's founding in 1949, but has not been invoked until now. The terrorist plane attacks on New York and Washington have shocked the world and sparked worldwide condemnation of such despicable acts. Here's Pei Jian with some of the responses from Asian countries.
Japan has called the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon bastardly and ordered tighter security for the U.S. bases scattered across the country. Japanese Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi said the attacks are a threat not just to the United States, but to all democracies, and he's very grieved. He expressed his regrets to the families of the victims and offered his condolences to the President of the United States and the people of America. South Korea has also beefed up security around the U.S. Embassy. President Kim Dae-jung vowed on Wednesday to take urgent measures to cope with the expected large impact on export-dependent South Korea from the financial turmoil caused by the multi-aircraft attacks in the United States. He also condemned the attack, saying terrorism is the enemy of peace and democracy-loving people of the world. Thailand has tightened security around the United States Embassy in Bangkok. Thai Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra has condemned the attacks and expressed his condolences for the loss of lives in New York and Washington. Pakistan's President General Pervez Musharraf described the attacks as brutal and horrible.
We share the grief of the American people in this grave national tragedy. We strongly condemn this most brutal and horrible act of terror and violence. This world must unite to fight against terrorism in all its forms and root out this modern-day evil.
Meanwhile, some 6,000 office workers from Kuala Lumpur's 88-story Petronas Twin Towers, the world's tallest buildings, were evacuated in a bomb scare only a few hours after the attacks in the United States. Police confirmed that they searched the building after receiving a phone call saying a bomb had been planted and would explode. However, no bombs were found in the Twin Towers. Peijing, CCTV.
Ordinary Chinese reeled with shock as news of the aircraft attacks in America spread throughout the country. Han Bin went to see what people are saying.
In China, shock was the first response. Then the attacks became the #1 topic of conversation. Most newspapers carried front-page pictures of the World Trade Center billowing smoke into the sky over Manhattan. China Central Television, as well as local TV stations, have all aired the attacks at the top of their bulletins. At an ongoing international forum in Beijing, the event was widely discussed among the Chinese participants. The president of the Chinese People's Institute of Foreign Affairs echoed the feelings of many.
In the name of the Institute, we solemnly condemn any terrorist act in the world, and we express our deep sorrow to the victims who lost their lives.
Professor Yan Xuetong says that the deadly attacks were highly organized with far-reaching consequences.
U.S. is not easily to get the support from all over the world. But I'm sure U.S. will get the major powers' support in terms of fighting against the terrorism, and U.S. will get many countries' support.
Some analysts are saying that the attacks give the U.S. government the push it needs to review its national security. Han Bin, CCTV.
Palestinian President Yasser Arafat joined other donors on Wednesday and gave his blood for the victims of the terror attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. Palestinian officials say his donation would start a blood drive for the casualties of the attacks. Arafat has condemned the attacks as a terrible act and said he would help track down those responsible if asked by the Americans. Meanwhile, dozens of Palestinian men, women, and children held a vigil in Jerusalem in sympathy for the United States. They gathered in front of the U.S. consulate, lighting candles and placing flowers along its walls. Israeli officials say thousands of Israelis donated blood on Wednesday. It was unclear if arrangements had been made to transfer the blood from Gaza and the West Bank to the United States. In the West Bank, Israeli tanks rolled into the Palestinian town of Jericho early Thursday, according to witnesses. Flares lit up the Jordan River Valley as loudspeakers on mosques called people out to fight against the Israeli invading forces. Some casualties have already been reported. You're now watching CCTV News, and coming up next ahead. Top Chinese legislator Li Peng is with current and former world leaders during a cooperation summit in Beijing. and China's giant panda natural habitat seeks to become a UN World Heritage Site. Chinese Premier Zhu Rongji is in Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan, for the final stop of his four-country European Asian tour. He held talks with his Kazakhstan counterpart Kassym-Jomart Tokayev Wednesday. Tokayev says that Kazakhstan continues to support China in its stance on the Taiwan issue and will not develop official relations with Taiwan in any form. Other major topics during the talks included oil and gas drilling, the utilization of water resources of cross-border rivers, as well as transportation. China and Kazakhstan signed an agreement on the utilization and protection of cross-border rivers after the talks. Bilateral trade volume stands at $1.5 billion, a nearly four-fold increase over the past decade. On Wednesday, Chinese top legislator Peng met with prestigious guests who are in Beijing to attend the China and the 21st Century Forum. Li Peng exchanged views with them on issues of concern to all countries. Pei Jian has more.
Li Peng, chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, had a tight schedule Wednesday. He met Vice Chairman of the Russian State Duma, Vladimir Lukin, former Chancellor of Germany, Helmut Kohl, and former UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali from Egypt. While meeting Vladimir Lukin, Li Peng reviewed the progress of Sino-Russian relations. He said the friendly treaty signed by the two countries in July has laid a legal foundation for developing stable bilateral ties. Lukin praised the achievements made in Russia-China relations and said he would, as always, make unremitting efforts to improve bilateral ties. Li Peng welcomed former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl at the Great Hall of the People. Li Peng said China and Germany share common ground on sticking to multipolarization. He said there was a huge potential for cooperation between the two countries. In another meeting, NPC Chairman Li Peng and former UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali discussed international issues, including the fight against terrorism, protection of developing countries, and basic principles in dealing with world affairs. Beijing, CCTV.
Chinese Vice President Hu Jintao met with former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing on Wednesday. Hu Jintao welcomed Kohl's visit to China to attend the 21st Century China and the World International Forum. He expressed his thanks for Kohl's contributions toward the smooth development of the Sino-German and Sino-European relationship. Kohl said that Germany thanked China for supporting it during the process of unification and hoped that China can realize its own reunification as soon as possible. The two sides agreed that the consolidation and development of cooperative relations between the two countries is in the fundamental interests of both peoples and is conducive to the peace and stability in the region. An international seminar on the new economy and perspectives of Asia-Europe trade and economic cooperation opened Wednesday in Beijing. Experts from the 25 member countries of the Asian-European Meeting, or ASEAN, are attending. The ASEAN was established in 1996, aimed at improving cooperation in trade and investment between Asia and Europe. During the three-day conference, the participants will discuss ways to enhance Asian-European cooperation in the new century. They believe that the new economy, along with the growth of information technology and internet technology, will boost cooperation between the two continents. The participants are expected to work on some issues on how to narrow the digital gap between Asia and Europe. China has achieved much in improving its agricultural techniques over the past 3 years. As a result, the quality and variety of agricultural produce are much better. Pei Jian has more.
Since the agricultural reform started 3 years ago, rural sites across China have been improving their agricultural products' quality to better meet market demands.
A batch of inferior strains of produce were eliminated. A group of specialized and highly valued agricultural products, better animal husbandry and aquaculture, have become new centers for economic growth.
More than 4.6 million hectares of high-quality rice have been cultivated. Areas for growing high-quality wheat and corn, as well as other grains, were also increased. The output of pork has been down, but beef and mutton production have been increased. The quality and quarantine controls on agricultural products are also better. Pei Jian, CCTV.
The turf industry is an emerging sector of China's economy. It took off only 3 years ago, but it has growing steadily. On Wednesday, an international exposition was held in Beijing to help spur more development of the turf industry and related businesses. Wang Xin has the report.
This was the third international expo on turf, landscape, and equipment held in Beijing. More than 10,000 domestic and overseas business people in the sectors of turf and turf equipment attended this year's event. Although the turf industry has a short history of development in China, it has been expanding rather steadily.
And we see some very good successes as a result of the efforts that have been made in the past several years, such as improvements to the sports stadiums. Just the green and the beautification that's taking place in China today is evident of that.
However, unlike certain other emerging industries such as the internet, the turf sector has not developed at a rapid rate. Turf manufacturers say the consumers' lack of expertise in the performance of various turf varieties has been the major problem.
So we see that the future in China is dependent upon bringing education along with the products into the market and training the people that you have already working with them in the care of the grasses.
This is exactly the kind of expo that turf makers hope can educate people about the varieties of turf and turf equipment. As China's economy continues to grow, a cleaner environment has become one of people's primary needs. A growing number of cities have begun putting more grassland in neighborhoods, in parks, and along the streets to create a greener living environment. Wang Xin, CCTV.
More stories will continue on CCTV News. Please stay tuned. A record number of passengers and freight moves through Hong Kong's international airport in August. And the natural habitat for the giant panda in Sichuan province applies to become a UN World Heritage Site. Welcome back. The Hong Kong International Airport has set a new record in passenger and freight transport, according to Hong Kong Airport Administration. The latest figures reveal that in August, more than 3 million passengers passed through the airport. That's nearly 2% higher than the same month last year and the highest number in the airport's history. The airport handled a total of 34 million arrivals and departures in the past 12 months, a year-on-year increase of 4.5%. The airport's cargo volume in the second quarter totaled 45 million tons, up 3% from the same period last year. China Post, the flagship carrier of China's postal services, has again accelerated its express mail service. Starting Wednesday, delivery of express mails from Shanghai to the 5 major cities of Shenyang, Wuhan, Xi'an, Shenzhen, and Fuzhou will be reduced from 2 days to 1. This is the last step in the 3-step plan for China Post in its efforts to speed up its express mail service. In March, the mail carrier launched 5 express delivery flights from Shanghai to Beijing, Guangzhou, Chengdu, Xiamen, and Qingdao. In July, China Post established the one-day express mail delivery between provincial capital cities located within 600 kilometers from each other. China Post officials say delivery of 85% of its express mails will be reduced to 1 day by the end of the year. Efforts are being stepped up to preserve archaeological relics in the Three Gorges Dam area. Because the completed project will mean the inundation of the area, entire villages are relocating elsewhere, and massive rescue archaeology projects are rushing to preserve what remnants of history they can. Pei Jian has the story.
This is the memorial temple of Tujuan, an ancient Chinese poet. He was a famous patriotic poet in ancient times. His homeland, the Chu kingdom, was in great danger when its neighboring state, Qin, threatened with war. The king of Chu refused to fight back and decided to surrender. Tujuan threw himself into the river in despair. To commemorate this patriotic poet, people built this temple, and now it has become one of the most famous historical relics in the area of the Three Gorges. There are other relics like this in the region. China is determined to protect them and will invest 1 billion yuan in this project. Some cultural relics will be removed. For instance, the Quyuan Temple and 23 relics in Zigui County, Hubei Province will be removed to Phoenix Hill. This project is expected to be finished in 2003, and people will then be able to revisit the relics. Meanwhile, there are more than 1,000 archaeologists in the same area using advanced equipment to look for any underground relics. According to experts, all of the relics will be rescued and protected before the whole Three Gorges project is finished in 2009. Pei Jian, CCTV.
China's giant panda natural habitat will apply to the United Nations to be named as a World Natural Heritage Site. The large and integrated habitat of giant pandas is centered in Wolong, China's southwest Sichuan province. It covers an area of 15,000 square kilometers, including 8 counties and cities. In those areas, there are about 300 wild giant pandas. There are also lesser pandas, golden monkeys, and other well-protected advanced plant communities. The UN World Natural Heritage Committee will investigate the area next year. The Manchurian and the South China tigers are among 3 endangered tiger species found in China. It is of great importance to take measures to save them from extinction. Zhu Yan takes you to Northeast and South China to see these rare big cats.
The Manchurian tiger, known as the Northeast China tiger in its native Chinese habitat, has some health problems. In a tiger park in Harbin, capital of Northeast China's Heilongjiao province, out of 5 newly born Manchurian tiger cubs, only 1 of them is healthy. It's the same story at other zoos and parks where some newborn tiger cubs are too weak to eat. Zoologists believe that inbreeding is the cause of the problem. If this problem is not solved as soon as possible, the species extinction may well be at hand. Tiger parks plan to import species from abroad to improve current bloodlines and save endangered ones. Meanwhile, in South China, the South China tigers have their own problems. In 1949, there were over 4,000 in China. 50 years later, the number less than 100, and most of them are kept in zoos. Having grown accustomed to life in artificial surroundings, their natural behavior and reproductive capabilities have changed over time. For this reason, the government has taken measures in the Meihua Mountain in West Fujian province, where the largest number of South China tigers survive in China. Tigers are being trained to live in the wild, where they can begin to resume their wild characteristics. The South China tiger is one of China's most valuable species, a high-priority animal under state protection. It is one of the world's top 10 most endangered species. Zhu Yan, CCTV.
Finally, here's a recap of the headlines from today's top stories. Chinese President Jiang Zemin speaks to U.S. President George W. Bush, offering condolences and assistance in the wake of Tuesday's terrorist attack. Emergency crews dig through mountains of rubble for survivors, but rescue efforts are threatened by fears of a new collapse.
On September the 12th,
in Brussels, NATO gives its backing to a possible military retaliation. And China's top lawmaker Li Peng meets with international dignitaries to discuss strengthening cooperation worldwide. But that's the news. I'm Dongwei in Beijing. Thanks for watching.